Well, hello, beautiful people. Thank you for joining us. This is the third in our panel of looking at trans and queer history in the month of October, which is super important since that is Trans and Queer History Month. And today, this panel is on confronting anti-Blackness in Brown, Indigenous, and communities of color. And we have three wonderful people joining us today. And I'm super excited for them to share their wisdom, their experience. We have Amber Barcel, co-chair of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum Seattle chapter. We have Rachael Lorenzo, co-founder and abortion access lead for Indigenous Women Rising. And we have Xelestiál, sorry if I'm butchering your name. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
It's Xelestiál.
Xelestiál. Is that better? Perfect. Moreno-Luz, visual arts coordinator for Reach LA. They're going to take a moment to introduce themselves, and then the floor is open to them because white person doesn't need to be involved in this chat anymore. So thank y'all, and I hope y'all enjoy the next hour of this wonderful chat. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Okay, so we can just, this is very informal and unplanned, so we'll just go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name's Amber, my pronouns are she, her. I'm based on Duwamish land, which is commonly known, as Seattle, Washington. And during my work, I work in statewide domestic violence policy. I'm here representing today, though, my role as a co-chair of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum Seattle chapter. From here on, that will be referred to as NAPAWF. I'm not sure what else to share, so I will listen to what my co-panelists say and might share more later.
Thank you, Xelestiál. My name is Rachael Lorenzo. I use they, them pronouns. I am from the Pueblo of Laguna and the Mescalero Apache tribe. I'm also Chicana. I have a lot of family in the borderlands in New Mexico and family in Mexico. I grew up in Laguna Pueblo, which is a reservation about 50 miles west of Albuquerque. And that is where my dad is from. My mom is Chicana and Apache, and I still have a lot of relatives in Mescalero, which is in southeastern New Mexico. It's way up in the mountains. It's very cold there. And I'm very worried about my elders because we're in a pandemic and they're very far removed and in very conservative territory. So I just want to name that. Currently, I'm on Tiwa, stolen and occupied Tiwa land, again, here in Albuquerque.
Thanks for sharing, Amber and Rachael. My name is Xelestiál. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently representing Reach LA as the visual arts coordinator. Reach LA is a nonprofit organization where sexual and social health meet legendary artist capacity. We primarily work with Black and Brown folks from the ages of 13 to 30. And, you know, some of my work before Reach LA, I've contributed multimedia arts to organizations like the Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network, Transgender Law Center, the Immigrant Youth Coalition, and the Trans Latina Coalition. And so a lot of my work primarily has been to collaborate in community-based efforts. And yeah, part of my organizing history comes from doing grassroots initiatives with the Queer and Trans People of Color Collective at Los Angeles City College and the Papalotes Collective, which both work to uplift the narratives of Black, Indigenous, LGBTQI+ communities in LA. So that's a little bit about me. Oh, and I would like to share that I'm on occupied Kumeyaay and Tongva land. And, you know, I think we were told that this sort of is like a conversation between us three, which is like kind of interesting because I've never met y'all. So it's like really exciting to be a part of this panel with you two. And the first question we have is, what is your experience with racism? I kind of, as someone who grew up low income, a child of migrants, I think for me, racism and classism are interlocked with one another. And as a gender nonconforming person who was also low income, I definitely felt very isolated in the spaces that I would occupy growing up. Oftentimes, my peers would sort of like leave me out of spaces because I was too poor, too brown, too gender nonconforming. And so I think for me, my experience with racism has always been just consistently diminishing my existence in a space. Um, yeah, just sort of like just to start off.
Yeah, I thank you so much for sharing that. My mom was 17 when she had me, and because I work in reproductive justice, that is something that I am so passionate about. You're absolutely right. Like class and maybe even immigration status, all of those things are so interconnected, and it's so important to name that, you know, when my mom had me, and being a young brown woman with a new baby, you know, racism in healthcare. So from the very beginning, being targeted by healthcare providers and being seen as incompetent and uneducated, and all of the things that white supremacy labels non-white Christian cis people with, right? So from the very beginning, and being Native, but also for myself, having here in New Mexico, having privilege, because I'm not very dark, but my husband is, and my dad is dark. My brothers are very dark, and having to navigate political spaces with my family and using what privilege I have in my proximity to whiteness has always been something that's so icky feeling. And where I'm at, there's a lot of talk of here we have a tricultural heritage of Hispanics, Native Americans, and white people, and it completely erases Black people. It completely erases Black Indigenous people and Black migrant people, Black LGBTQ people. Like it, from my vantage point, while I've experienced racism in the classroom, in the workplace, in politics, in reproductive justice movements, quite honestly, there's also that privilege I have to acknowledge, and how am I making space within my own community to talk about these things, so that way Black folks, Black Indigenous folks can say, like, here's my experience with it, and we just sit back and listen to their experience and figure out how we can do better.
I realized it was very capitalist of me to only describe myself as my work. So I'll also share that I'm a Korean immigrant through adoption, and I was born in Suwon, South Korea, and I was raised in very rural Nebraska. And I just moved to Seattle 2 years ago to go to grad school. So that's a little more about me. And I would say my experience with race and racism has been, it's still just an ongoing journey for me. My experience with racism was actually really lonely, being one of very few people of color, and definitely one of a handful of Asian folks in my county. We barely even have towns there. So I would say that the experience was lonely. I was experiencing not so much blatant violent racism, but a lot of microaggressions. And I didn't even learn what microaggressions were until I was 25. I'm 33 now. And it was just an awakening for me to understand that that's the type of racism I was experiencing. Yeah, a lot of fetishization is something that I experienced from people that were my age, younger, but also significantly older, which was very strange for me. I also benefited from the mono minority myth, which says that Asians in America are, the good minority, that they go to college, they get good jobs, they have families, they buy houses, they build generational wealth. So I benefited in that way as well. But my journey with racism is definitely, or my journey with race is very much ongoing right now, and trying to figure out my identity as Korean American or Korean American is a big part of it. I can ask the second question and then not answer it first. What is anti-Blackness and how does it impact Black people? And I would actually push it to say I would just say, what is anti-Blackness? Because I think we can go beyond how it affects individuals and maybe larger systems.
Right. I definitely see a lot of truth to that. For me, anti-Blackness is both the conscious and unconscious behavior that discriminates and harms Black communities. And essentially, anti-Blackness impacts the social, sexual, spiritual, and mental health of Black communities. It affects whether Black folks can obtain employment, whether Black folks are seen and given proper health and reproductive justice. I think that anti-Blackness is so sinister that it even excludes Black folks from movements, right? And so it's kind of like what Rachael was saying about Black migrants, right? It's actually Black migrants that make up the largest population of people in detention centers. And so I think that anti-Blackness has such a role in excluding movements in the world that there needs to be so much more to address anti-Blackness within our communities. And so just briefly touching on that, that's sort of what I think anti-Blackness encompasses.
Yeah, in my community where I grew up, like I said, on a reservation, there is so much anti-Blackness within Indigenous communities. And I would even say anti-Blackness within my Apache community. And even though I didn't grow up there, my family is still there. I was still exposed to them throughout my life. And hearing, Xelestiál is right. It's so nefarious and it's so embedded in the way that we talk to each other and what kind of media we consume and what kind of clothing we buy. Everything is embedded with anti-Blackness, and it's up to us to unlearn that. And I say that because when it comes to at least my experience growing up on a reservation, we would hear elders say, you better put some sunscreen on because you don't want to get all black. And my sister-in-law is Black in Pueblo, and she didn't grow up with a whole lot of other Black people in her life until now. She's in her 20s, but until she was an adult, just a few years ago. And, being made fun of because of her hair, because, the common perception of Native people is that we all have straight hair. And she probably got made fun of more than I did for having curly hair, really kinky, coily hair. And just even in the way that we critique each other's looks and how long we spend outside. There are Native social media accounts that do Native memes. And there were a few memes last year that were just so problematic and comparing Indigenous foods to Black people, don't be like this, Indigenous food, burnt. That kind of just disgusting, ignorant stuff. And I hope and pray that they learned how to be better and say crap like that. And it sucks when it's even coming from our traditional leaders, from our tribal leaders. You're supposed to be guiding the people in our traditions, which we barely have left. We're trying our best to hold on to it, but that doesn't mean, at the expense of excluding our Black community members who are not Black or Indigenous. They can exist in those identities at the same time. And I've learned so much from my sister-in-law and about how, as a colleague and as a relative, how best Indigenous Women Rising can show up for her as an employee and go beyond, here's a personal day off, and just, extending grace and being more cognizant of mental health when we're developing policies for our organization, right? Like, how is, like, centering Black people, essentially, even as an Indigenous person, we're all existing on stolen land, right? But explicitly centering the needs of Black people on Indigenous land within our workspaces, within our classrooms, and saying, what is it that Black children or Black professionals are going to need? Because I guarantee you, when we center the needs of especially Black folks, everyone is going to benefit. Everyone. No one loses anything. And I think that's such a white supremacist way of thinking, that centering those who are most marginalized, which is such a common buzz phrase. So maybe one day we can unpack that. But centering the folks who are most marginalized is absolutely the way to go. It's not a zero-sum game. No one has anything to lose from making sure we're treating people equitably and making sure that everyone has their basic needs met.
Yeah, I think that, making sure that we think a lot about equity is sort of like what I think about when we want to create spaces of reparation for Black communities, because oftentimes people are like, oh yeah, we need to be treated equal, but it's like, I think that's like a tired human rights campaign statement that needs to be discarded, right? We need to really think about equity. And just really quickly, sort of like briefing what you said about how Indigenous folks or Native American communities have made memes about like Black folks. I was a part of a summer digital media camp by Me Too, where one of the content creators made like a video meme about, he was Mexican. So it was like him, this other person, and I guess like the butt line of the joke was a Black person. And, in the joke, it was like, oh, we're drinking Coronas. And then the Black person was like, oh, can I have one? And then the Mexican folks were like, nah, you don't like this. How about like I offer you a watermelon instead? And, for me, I think that like oftentimes Latinx communities exclude Black folks from the Latin American diaspora, when quite in fact, like Black folks make up a large percentage of the Latin American diaspora. And it's really disgusting and disrespectful that people continue to make it seem like Black folks and Latinx-ness are not, can be exclusive with one another when they're actually like, they're both the same thing. And so for me, it comes back to like making sure that we're calling out these sort of like instances. And all of the staff of that camp didn't say anything. It was me and like the other gender non-conforming person making a ruckus and being like, yo, this is what's killing Black communities, right? Like this behavior and these attitudes are exactly what are killing our communities, our Black communities. So it just like reminded me of that when you mentioned Rachael about like the meme. Yeah. And also I know tons of Black Mexicans that love Corona. Like that's ridiculous. Anyways, go ahead, Amber.
Yeah, to touch on what I think anti-Blackness is, the way I think about it a lot is, in the subtle ways that it can show up. And I don't think they're subtle to Black people. I think it's subtle in our recognition of them. But I think about, who gets second chances for literally anything, who gets thrown under the bus first when something goes wrong in your space, in your workplace, in your life. And then does the whole community get blamed for it? Sometimes, yes. I think about, I don't have an Asian family and my family is white. So I don't have this personal experience, but what my NAPAWF sisters tell me are that like sometimes within Asian families, they may experience, like the colorism and your skin is getting too dark, or it also determines, who you can date, who you can marry, who you can have a long-term relationship or even a friendship with. I think that anti-Blackness shows up in the way that we pick apart what we appreciate about Blackness, what we like about it, what we want to replicate, and we do that and we kind of forget the rest. So I'm thinking of I'm thinking of K-pop and how it benefits so much from Blackness. And I feel like, I don't know much about the K-pop movement, but I feel like they're working on it. Like I feel great about the fans. But that's just a critique that I hear, that I don't know how much they're working on it right now or like where they are with that. I think that anti-Blackness is also like buying into the ways that the model minority myth wants to pit like people like me against Black folks, and then just like wanting to scoot our way closer to whiteness to distance ourselves from people that are perceived as like bad minorities or something. So I think it shows up when we are not like brave enough to say that we won't allow ourselves to be pitted against someone in that way. Yeah, I'm still working on my definition of that. And then I definitely see it in the workplace. I absolutely see it in state policy where I'm working right now, especially with all the police reform that's coming up, and in the anti-violence movement. So it's also comes down to who is believed, whose stories are listened to, whose trauma do we just love to like absorb and put onto movies and books and all that. Yeah, I'll let someone else answer or ask the third question.
Yeah, I can ask it. What is the legacy of anti-Blackness in the trans queer rights movement?
Well, I mean, I think it's like so complex. It's also so watered down by mainstream media. Just like very like diving into history, right? I think it really comes down to me, the legacy of like anti-Blackness in the trans queer rights movement is the mistreatment of Black trans women and trans misogynoir, right? And so for folks that don't know what the word misogynoir means, misogynoir is essentially misogyny towards Black women. And so trans misogynoir is trans misogyny towards Black women, right? And so if we think about the first images of Black trans women in mass media, it's associated with sex work and criminalization. So in 1836, a Black trans woman named Mary Jones was tried for larceny and jailed because she was like stealing from white men and making her come up, because that's what she should be doing, And so she essentially, this person, this sort of like a media publisher, created these images of her and then mass produced them. And in the image of her, it's an image that says Mary Jones, the man monster. So very much like the institutionalization of Black trans women is criminalization and sex work, right? And so that sort of like pivots the legacy of how Black trans women are treated and diminished in spaces. And so I think for me, like the legacy of anti-Blackness within the queer trans rights movement starts at home, where we're mistreating some of our most vulnerable and some of our most marginalized. Yeah, that's sort of like what I have to say about that.
So a part that like really doesn't get included in this movement for equity for queer and trans folks is the history of what we would term today as queer and trans folks within Indigenous communities. And on my Apache side, we have a woman, Lozen, who never married, was like stories of her describe her as queer or a lesbian. And she always fought in wars against her brother, and she was said to have like these very special, literally magical powers where she could hold out her hands and know where the enemy was coming from by putting her hands out and like feeling in her palms, so she could protect her people. And she was also a midwife. And one of the most famous stories about her is that, while she was trying to get her people to safety, there was a pregnant person who was giving birth, and they managed to keep that person and their new baby safe in the wilderness while they're being hunted down by Apache scouts and the federal government. And how is that not part of this history, right? And as a Pueblo person, and Laguna Pueblo specifically, where I'm from, our language is called Keres, and that's the root language, because there are other Pueblos who speak like different dialects of it. And there's a term in there that I grew up hearing, and it's kukuimu, and that is essentially a gay man, or like a more like fluid person who is feminine. And growing up, I heard that term used towards young boys and young men who were made fun of to be like too soft or too feminine. And that broke my heart. And so, my husband, who is also Pueblo, is, I'm learning a lot from him because he comes with a lot of knowledge. And we both grew up very traditional, and hearing those terms and reclaiming them is so important to us, because it is only within the last like maybe 3 years that trans women within our community have been able to wear the regalia for women. And that, we have, my kids have an Uncle Les, who is a trans man and is now being acknowledged in the masculine version of greetings, which is so sacred. And you can tell it makes him happy and it makes him feel affirmed that we're acknowledging him as he is in his heart and how he is living his life. And now I would like for our tribal leaders to like accept trans folks into our traditional and our sacred ceremonies as they are. Because we know that based on the language, which is not a word for word translation to English, it's like phrases that describe past events and present events or scenery, that there are phrases that describe the inclusion of queer and trans people. And if we say that, we're trying to retain our language, that also means that we have to include queer and trans community members in that. And when I look at the broader movement, I think of gay, white, cis gay men and women who are constantly calling the cops on Black trans women in Atlanta, thus the need for an organization called Snap for Freedom, who I love and have learned from, and please check them out. But I think of, how that history of queer and trans folks within Indigenous communities and the criminalization of Black folks within cities and towns by other gay or lesbian, white, cis people, and the connection to land that Black people whose ancestry is tied to stolen people to come to this continent, they can't even get their basic needs met. And on top of that, are being criminalized for just existing, where it makes even not straight white people uncomfortable for them to just live and try to survive. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think that I'll add is what I notice is anti-Blackness and the trans and queer rights movement is, we're talking a lot about history. So just erasure of what Black trans women have done for this movement, and really in my eyes continue to do for this movement every single day. And, again, like what parts of Black, queer, and trans culture do white gay people like to pull from, like even including white like trans people like to pull from as well, is the observation that I have. I'll stop there. I think you two said it like so well.
That is such a great point that you bring up, Amber, though, about even the language that we're using and the mannerisms even, or clothing or makeup that is pulled from what Black, queer, and trans folks have laid out for us. Like, we do not acknowledge the beautiful gift of their existence in this realm, and literally building up society and culture that we steal from them and have the audacity to not affirm their existence here. That is such a good point. And like with makeup, you have makeup artists like James Charles, or like makeup developers who are not straight, but rarely acknowledge where they get their inspo from.
Right. Everything comes from Black culture. And that's that. Like,
Panel
that's
done.
that. That's that.
Yeah.
You know, I think question number 4, right? Like, why must we confront anti-Blackness in the movement and in ourselves? What I find particularly like profound about this question is not necessarily why in the movement, because it's obvious, right? Because Black life matters. Black life is important. Black life is sacred, right? And if Black folks are free, we're all free, right? But I think more importantly, like, why must we confront anti-Blackness in ourselves is really what sort of speaks to me, because literally I'm raised in an anti-Black world. So there has to be work done to unroot the anti-Blackness that one has within themselves, right? And so I think that, how does it even look like to unroot the anti-Blackness within yourself? Well, how are you going to scream Black Lives Matter when there are no Black folks in your life that you can support and you can love, right? Like, I don't understand how folks are so eager to talk about, to sort of like perform this sort of like movement, perform the movement, right? But they're not actually embodying the movement. And I think that's what I find particularly important when we're talking about conversations that include uplifting Black folks. So for me, it's important because Black lives matter, Black life matters, Black life is sacred. And of course, for me, it's about making sure that I unroot all the anti-Blackness that I've been taught my entire life. And that also starts, and that also means that I need to show up for Black people. That means I need to show up for Black initiatives. And that means I need to show up for Black life.
Yeah. I think that, first starting with ourselves, what I noticed after the uprisings, after George Floyd's murder, was that I noticed a lot of Asian Americans really coming to terms with a racial reckoning and realizing, I thought all along that I was close to whiteness, and then COVID taught me that I am still a target. And I think that, I don't think that's everyone's experience, but this is what I noticed. And then taking up so much space when it came to the movement for Black lives, because here I've showed up, but I also want to talk about like what this movement means for me. And I think that taking up space is something that we should not be doing right now if we're working so much on ourselves and what this reckoning means for us. So what I've done with my sisters is we just created space to talk about anti-Blackness in our community. And it's like, we want to do this before we actually show up, like physically for people. We want to be able to talk about this within ourselves. And then we will go to marches. We'll take care of people that are there. We will help with mutual aid networks and community food efforts. So for us, it was like, let's not do the reactionary, like white supremacy. I need to talk about how I'm not a this or that. And let's really unpack it within ourselves. And also, I think that we need to, okay, so it's like ourselves and the movement, and those are two very like opposite things for me. So in the middle, it's like in our community, I think we also need to ask ourselves, for Asian Americans, like, why is it always our first gen family members that we blame for racism? And in some cases, it's certainly valid, but it's like, as some second gen folks are maybe are harboring like more internal racism. So I don't know. I think there's just a lot that I mean, like my friends have come to terms with as far as our positionality. As far as why we need to confront it in the movement, and I'm part of multiple movements. So the one I'm pouring the most energy in is the anti-violence movement. I think we have to confront it because the anti-violence movement and policing is so anti-Black. Like, it is built on anti-Blackness. Like policing was built on slave patrol. So I think we have to confront it, especially in policy and reform. And I know that's not everyone's activism, and that's totally okay because it is not accessible, I think. But if not us, then who? Is it going to be the white men in power? Are they going to be the ones? And is it going to be temporary? Is it like, oh, in this moment, I feel this way, so I'm going to react, but then I'm not going to do anything? Yeah, so I think I think we have to confront it, because also, like, the Black folks in my life show up for everything, you know, immigration, reproductive justice. They show up for undocumented folks. Like, they show up everywhere. And is it so convenient to only show up when there's this really big march for Black lives? But I think we should also show up because Black folks have always shown up for us.
That is an amazing point. I think this year just exposed what many of us, and what of course Black folks already knew about inequity and injustice. And for me, it was looking at all of the things that I love and that I enjoy doing, and just deep diving. Like, this sounds kind of like it's not related, but like I really found myself loving sewing this summer, and I started sewing masks and clothes. I'm actually like not bad. And I used to hate baking. I hated it, and cooking. And this year, I found I'm actually like really good at it. So like really deep diving into like what have Black people contributed to the world of sewing and quilting. And then I found out that quilting is such a sacred thing for Black women in the South. And with baking, you know, trying something new that my kids haven't ever eaten before, and like sharing the history of that dish with them. And so it was just really analyzing like, where have Black people contributed the most, and how can I share that with people who aren't, who don't know what to do but want to do something. And you know, within reproductive justice, especially around abortion, there were so many white women who were like, okay, so I'm gonna do the Underground Railroad of abortion, and like drive people, and they can stay with me, and like all of these things, right? And how can I house, you know, Black people who are like, you know, fleeing, and need like a place, or and things like that. Like those things already exist. Black people especially have already created these mechanisms to protect each other. Our job is to learn from what is already there and ask, what do you need? Do you need money? Do you need volunteering? Like, how can I use what I'm good at? Is this even helpful for you? Like, what is it that you need? Is it a skill set? Is it what? And then tapping into our privilege, into our network, into whatever we have, and redistributing that, right? Like, again, it's so ingrained in our minds and in our lives to live in a zero-sum world. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can envision something that is anti-Black and anti-racist and beautiful and equitable, right? And so it really does start within ourselves. And I'm glad that this is the, like, kind of the last question, right? That you know, this is a really good self-reflection tool of how are we doing that on our own. And sometimes it even, you know, I donate as much as I can, and since I haven't had to pay for childcare this year, or gas for commuting, because it was like a 2-hour commute for me every day pre-COVID, being able to redistribute that money. But like, do we have to post it on social media? Like, at what point are we doing it for the kudos and the like, thank you so much? And how much are we doing it? And so like, now I donate anonymously. I don't put my name out there. I don't put it on social media. So it's just like, what are these small habits and tidbits and everything that we can do where it's not bringing attention to ourselves, but rather we're sharing what we have with the folks who really need it, and encouraging folks, non-Black folks within our circles, professional, social, yada yada, to give back, and without having needing to do it so you can get a pat on the back and be reassured that you're doing the right thing. That I think that this year has really exposed a lot of that. And you know, like when it's Columbus Day, Thanksgiving, Indigenous Heritage Month, my org gets a ton of donations, but every other month of the year, y'all don't really care about missing and murdered Indigenous women. Non-Black folks, you know, okay, we're gonna care about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, rest in power. We're gonna care about them over the summer, but we're not gonna continue those conversations right now. Like, we don't see those conversations happening as often now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You sort of like answered question number 5 in like a nutshell, which is 3 action items to address anti-Blackness. You know, just like voicing off of what you said, it's really about like donating because you want to support versus donating for accolade and for like for show, for performance. Really is sort of like what I mentioned earlier, that a lot of folks tend to perform. Yeah. I mean, I'm just kind of like, you said all the things that I was thinking about for addressing anti-Blackness, but I think also, you know, when we're talking about anti-Blackness, like, I think we also need to talk about desirability. We need to talk about like fat phobia and the way that like folks that are fat and Black even experience hella more violence, right? Because fatness is seen as undesirable. And so I just want to bring that up like very briefly, you know, because I keep thinking about the ways that if like we're skinny and we're pretty, that essentially is a privilege, and people are going to want to donate to you more, right? So I think a way to address anti-Blackness is to really think about your own, addressing anti-Blackness within yourself, but also thinking about your own internalizations of desire and your own internalizations of what you think is beautiful, because oftentimes that leaves out a whole community of people. Yeah, so I think, like I said, voicing off of what Rachel said, like really just like donating to Black-led initiatives, and also like actually donating to people versus to orgs, you know. I think it's important because a lot of these orgs are getting money from like white entrepreneurs who feel like they're doing something, the white saviors, right? But it's like some of the folks that like really need support are not getting the support they need. Yeah, so just making sure you're donating to like folks directly, making sure you're addressing your own internalizations of anti-Blackness and desire, and also calling out your family members. Like my mom and I butt heads all the time because I don't, like, she's upset. She's like, I'm your mom, I could do what I want. I was like, no, girl. Like, no, you can't. Um, yeah, I just call out your mom. There's like call out your grandma. Like for all my non-Black people watching, like call out everybody. Like, and if you don't believe in the call out method, that's good, and I support that. Do the call in method, right? Like there's no need to call out your grandma at the dinner table. Just like set her to the side and be like, hey, so I think what you said was like not okay. My aunt said something really problematic, really fucked up, where she's like, she told my cousin, like my baby cousin, like, oh my God, you look so good with green eyes because your skin is so light. And I told her, I was all like, you know, that was anti-Black as fuck, right? Like there are plenty of Black folks with green eyes that are gorgeous, and like that was fucked up. She's like, no, I didn't mean it that way. Excuse my language, y'all. But she's like, no, I didn't mean it that way. And I was like, yeah, you did. Like, yeah, you did. Like, how other way do you mean it then? Yeah, so just like calling in people, making sure that you're like doing your part to call in folks, donate, address your own internalizations of desire and the way you've been taught that Blackness is not desirable, because Blackness is so desirable. Blackness is beauty, and we need to acknowledge more of that.
Y'all are amazing. I love the way you just remembered everything you said and summarized it. I'm so impressed. This also brings up for me when you said like call out your family. You know, for me, my family's white, but when they say racist thing about, they don't really say racist things about Asian people, but they say racist things about other people. And it's like when they go for like one of us, they're going for all of us. So it's like you can't say nothing, no matter how lonely and hard it can be. I think that I just think we have to speak up. It's like, oh, they're not, you know, people aren't really talking about like my race, but they're being racist and being able to call that out. And that is a journey for me, for sure. I'll say the things that I'm working on. I think that, you know, I used to hold myself kind of high on a pedestal, like, oh, I understand anti-racism works so well because I've done so much reading and talking and podcasts. And that's not true. It's like, I'm absolutely guilty of it. I have done anti-Black things. I continue to do anti-Black things. So I think what drives me, like what's hard for me is to see like white folks when they feel like they are beyond understanding and can now start to condemn other white folks for their racism. It's like, I don't want to be like that. So I'm trying hard not to. And I would say other things that action items, like know that, especially for Asian Americans, and I know that AAPI is a more inclusive one, but in an effort to be inclusive, like we're still leaving Pacific Islanders out. So when so that's why I'm choosing Asian Americans, because I think that there is a difference. So it's not to leave folks out, it's just to acknowledge that like there's more privilege within Asian Americans. Know that our history is political. So when it's like, oh, I think the trope that Asians are quiet and apolitical is so old. And if you don't believe that yet, just look into the history of like cross solidarity with Asian American people. It's actually really, it's really amazing to see what like Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, like all those amazing people, like the solidarity that they've had, and understand that white supremacy treats us so differently, right? And that doesn't mean that we don't care about each other, but it means that we have to figure out like how we're going to show up for each other, whether it's slavery or genocide or colonialism and war. Like white supremacy treats us so differently, but that doesn't mean that we get to look the other way if it's not treating us that way, right? And then I have two more things. I would say, if it's not in your comfort zone to show up in ways that other people show up, I'm not saying do what is so unsafe, so uncomfortable for you, but please also push yourself. And we don't get to back out when it's too hard. When it gets too hard, once we've been called out for doing it wrong or doing something anti-Black, I don't think that we get to back out, because that is a white supremacist thing to say, oh, this is too hard, I'm done, and now I don't care about this group. And then lastly, this is really easy. Whenever you're buying something, like I always try to ask myself, which Black business is also selling this? Like what one can I go to? So I'm sure a lot of cities have lists built up. I'm in Seattle, so there are plenty of lists. But always ask yourself, does a Black person sell that? That's what I'm trying to do.
That's a really good one. I really appreciate you saying that. Like making sure that we're supporting like Black businesses is definitely something that folks can have. It's a more accessible way for folks to really be intentional in the way they support Black folks, right?
Yeah.
And just briefly coming back to like what I said earlier about like all Black Lives Matter and sort of like it really addressing the internalization of desire, right? Like when we talk about like Black lives, like we also need to think about like disabled lives. We need to think about folks who are mentally ill. We need to think about folks who are neurodivergent, right? And I just wanted to bring that up briefly because oftentimes these folks do get excluded from the conversation. And yeah, y'all, like we just need to do so much better. And I definitely am not like the expert at addressing racism, right? So I think for me, like I'm always willing to grow and I'm always willing to listen to someone if I have said something wrong. I love accountability, so.
Same.
I also want to bring up something really briefly. Xelestiál, you said folks, Black folks who are living with mental health and might be autistic, or just neurodivergent. I'm still learning what like the full meaning of that term. That we as non-Black people should not be showing up just for Black people who have passed away, because their murders are horrendous, and we should not only be trying to protect Black people who we perceive as kind or nice, we need to be showing up for all Black people, even if, you know, like they're rude. I don't give a shit if they were, you know, rude, we perceive as rude or whatever. They're still deserving of humanity for the mere fact that they exist. And as non-Black people, I have seen so many times within reproductive justice, within politics, if you were just nicer, if you had just said that with a different tone, then maybe I would take you more seriously. Or maybe if you had just listened, you know, like Sandra Bland is a good and terrible example. Rest in power, Sandra. You know, people were saying like she was just so rude. If she wasn't rude, they wouldn't have treated her that way and she would still be alive. Like, no, that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about who you're essentially saying that who you perceive, which is so arbitrary, as kind or nice or polite, is more deserving of people who are not. And so like I saw a lot of movement around Elijah, who was murdered by police in Aurora, Colorado, where people were like, this sweet boy, yes, he was sweet. Yes, we love him. And, you know, we pray for him. And that story breaks our hearts. But we have to also be thinking about like, who do we think is more deserving? Because that's anti-Blackness. We need to be addressing within ourselves and within with each other. So I just wanted to name that too.
Absolutely. And so much of like the policing conversations, it's, well, don't talk back. I'm like, if a white woman was arrested for something she didn't do, she would flip shit. Like, it's totally understandable that people are defending themselves. They are upset, they are terrified. And this whole narrative of just be quiet is so anti-Black and so violent. Like, it literally kills people.
Agreed. It's like Black folks do not need to be palatable to deserve kindness, humanity, and worth or value, right? Like they don't need to be palatable to you, and that's that. There's a question from one of the panelists, or there's a question from somebody in the audience who says, I'm really interested in structures for accountability when people mess up. And I'm wondering if there's structures or frameworks you've used when you mess up or when other people mess up that are helpful. You know, I think the first thing is to like not be reactionary. I think that's sort of like when someone calls you in or when someone like says something, you know, like you jump into, well, you didn't tell me this, or like, well, I'm trying, or this, like that's reactionary. Like that's a no. That's a no-go. It's not really gonna solve anything. Like what you can do is like, hey, I hear you, right? I hear you, and I just need to reflect a little bit about what you're telling me so that I can respond in a way that's like helpful, right? Or respond in a way that holds me accountable. And so when you're stepping back from someone trying to hold you accountable, I think what you can do is like ask somebody in your life to support you in this like process to like decompress and unpack what is being asked of you or what is being called in of you. And that is a lot of labor to ask of somebody. You have to remember that when you're like engaging in that process. But I hope that like whoever you ask to support you in that labor like has the capacity to do so, because we can't just hold ourselves. It's hard to hold yourself accountable alone, and it's also hard to grow alone. So I think for me, it's about, like I said, like making sure that you're stepping back before you react, and then checking in on like what is being asked of you and checking in with someone so they can support you in unpacking it, and then returning and being like, hey, like, this is what like I hear you said, and like I just want to say like you're right, or whatever the case may be, and really just show that like you're willing to grow and willing to sort of like give an actionable item, something that like you can't just say I'm sorry and I apologize, right? You're gonna be like, I apologize and this is what I can do moving forward, or what would you like me to do moving forward so I don't cause harm again, right? So that's sort of like what I think about what accountability can look like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is such a good question. I'll say that someone held me accountable once, and my first reaction, I almost did it, was to cry. And I was like, oh my God, I'm about to drop some white woman tears on this person. Rachel's eyes just got really big. I don't know if that was based on that. And ever since then, I've been like, don't react the way a white woman would. Like, do not do this. Do not do this to people. So yeah, that was some growth right there. And I don't do that anymore, but that was my instinct. Like, I need to get out of this and I need to not look like guilty. So I feel tears coming and I'm like, this is so fucked up. That's my immediate reaction. So it's like, just take a second and even if it's not coming across in a way that you think is constructive, it's like, what's really at the root here? Like, what are they trying to tell me? Like, try to see past maybe your initial reaction of hurt and defensiveness. And I would say if you need support, you know, if it were to be around anti-Blackness, I would say, like, I would go to my Asian American friends, like my sisters, especially because we have been talking so much about anti-Blackness in our communities. We've been having these conversations about how we want to respond to it, how we want to work on it. I wouldn't go to my Black friends for something like that. But on a larger system of accountability, what's really helped me learn more about accountability versus like punishment. And I know Black and Pink is a leader in this topic and have been having a lot of conversations, but if you want to start, if you haven't already, just looking into transformative justice, there's so many resources out there. There's so many like webinars happening right now because of the policing conversations. And it sounds like transformative justice is on this scale of abolition, which is certainly part of it, but it's also so much about how we interact with each other. And the fact that, you know, multiple truths can be held and that we are all capable of causing harm. And when we recognize those things, we can start to acknowledge or possibly repair. So I say look into transformative justice and don't be so overwhelmed by the largeness of it, because it actually is very, it's very much about how we interact with each other.
Yes, to all of that. I have definitely been called in, and yes, do not be reactionary. I'm trying to relearn how to trust my gut more, and so if I feel in my gut when I've been called in or something doesn't feel right, when someone says something like on a call or in a meeting or something, to trust my gut and what that feeling is, and let that be the reaction, and that always checking in with yourself. I check in with myself and remind myself, Black people don't need your tears, they need your action and protection. So how can I make sure that in the future they are getting that protection and they know that there are non-Black people? Because again, going back to like the whole accolades thing, it doesn't help them, and it's probably such a burden on them to like have someone cry or like, I'm so sorry, you know, like when I get misgendered, and I correct someone, it's really uncomfortable for me to like, it's okay when it's not okay. So I actually stop saying it's okay when someone apologizes. I just say thank you, and recognize that when someone calls you in or calls you out and is taking the time to tell you that what you did was messed up, take that as a gift and tell them thank you for being aware enough or like present enough to catch what you were saying or doing in the moment, and acknowledge that what they're trying to offer you is growth. It is not to demean you. It is not meant to dehumanize you. It is meant to make you aware that you dehumanized someone and made them feel little. So take that as a gift to be better, and to grow from that. And you can ask them, what can I do to help you, or to help us, or to make sure that this doesn't happen again? I absolutely ask that, but also accept that they're gonna say, I don't have the time for that. I have no spoons to help you with that. And be okay with that, and be okay with the fact that they may not trust you in the future, and that the only way you can gain trust from that person or that group or whatever is through your actions. You can say sorry all darn day, but the truth of the matter is you harmed someone or you harmed a group, and the only thing you can do is grow and make sure your future actions don't reflect all of that. And I absolutely am trying my best to get to that place of being an abolitionist. And so transformative justice and looking at carceral ways of, or like punitive punitive not justice,
Restorative justice?
like making sure that when we're correcting each other, it's not like punitive, like
There's no
we're counting
punishment,
someone.
kind of.
Yeah, like not
Oh,
resorting to like punishment, like
I think I see what you're saying, like we don't want to dispose of someone because of like harm being caused. Is that kind
right.
of like what I'm getting at?
Yeah,
Hearing from like Amber, like around this idea of like not asking our Black friends of this emotional labor to like support us in addressing harm, right? That's like super important. And Rachel, just like you were saying, like accountability is a gift. Accountability is a gift. Like, so you giving the option to someone to hold themselves accountable is truly like a present, and they need to cherish that. But I think also something about like the transformative justice movement that is lacking is like, what if the survivor does want the person to be disposed of? Like, what do we do then? Right? Like sometimes the survivor, like we talk about like, oh, we don't want to dispose people and we don't want to punish people and we don't want to participate in these carceral logics. And I'm for that and I believe in that. And at the same time, if the survivor is saying, I don't want this person around me and I don't want this person in my spaces anymore, and I need all of the people around me to block this person, what then do we do, right? It's such a complicated subject, and unfortunately I don't have the answer to that, and I don't know how to like, right? And so like for me, it has come down to like trusting what the survivor needs and what the survivor wants, and then moving forward.
yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like what the transformative justice, I'm not like all TJ, I've just been hearing a lot about it. I think what is said is then that community would show up in that way, and the police would not be the ones, like the state would not be involved, and that community could hopefully keep a survivor safe. Like, why is the only option for this survivor to turn to the carceral system? And then beyond that, it's really like out of their hands. So the hope is that community can do whatever the survivor needs. I think we're at time. Okay, Nikki's gonna pop in.
I could really just listen to you for the rest of the day. Like, yeah, that so much wonderful, wonderful everything. Couple of just logistical questions that we had. This video will stay up on our Facebook, and then we recorded it and we'll be posting this along with the other 3 in this series on anti-Blackness on our YouTube page. So take a look at that. And when you're searching for us on YouTube, make sure you put the "and" in black and pink. Otherwise, you're getting a K-pop band and all their fan sites, which is fine, but there are thousands of them and you won't be able to find us. I want to definitely thank our incredible panelists for sharing with us today your experiences and your expertise. Like, whew, I was snapping along with everything. Just a reminder to please share. Let's redistribute our wealth, especially for folks who are white like me. Xelestiál, Cash App is Xelestiál Moreno-Luz, and Venmo is at the Age of Eve. The Age of Eve. Rachel's Venmo is R Lorenzo with an X. XO, is that right? And then Amber's Venmo is at Amber Barcel. Those are in both the chats, in the Facebook and in the Zoom chat. So please send some money. We're anti-capitalist, but we live in the capitalist system. So, and they're gonna spend it on black-owned businesses. So there you go. Like this is a great cycle. We want to thank y'all. Thank you. So amazing. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
if you have decided that voting is part of your harm reduction journey, please make sure that is done sooner than later. And we don't know what the hell is about to happen, everybody, and continue to happen, but we do know that we're all in this together. And I'm just so grateful. Thank you all for filling us, and we will see you all soon.
Yeah, see you later.